years also. We're hardwired that way, I'm convinced, in the sense that there are good evolutionary reasons to believe that what we call parochial altruism is a fact, which means, yes, you can be kind, beneficent, generous to the in-group, but to the out-group, that's an enemy. And I think we're probably quite well primed for that. It's one of the most decisive features of psychology, social psychology, that there is a difference between the in-group and the out-group, and that you can artificially create the out-group over almost anything. You tell kids you're blue or you're red in the morning. By afternoon, the red group hates the blue group and the blue group hates the red group, and they're not playing games. They're not realists trying to play a game. They actually are now generating emotional input into how can we defeat the other side. So it's, to my mind, it's pretty deep. How it works is complicated. I don't think anybody's really figured it out completely. I'm not in the inner sanctums of the blob most of the time, or very rarely, though I know a lot of these people. Some are my students, some, and maybe they're on the outer shell of the inner blob. I don't know, but I think that there are so many mechanisms of self-reinforcement, of self-glorification, that partly it is the media, the mainstream media, following the dictates from above, who pay the bills, who make the advertising, who have infiltrated the mainstream media anyway, literally with personnel from the CIA or other places over the years. We know this. Or it is the self-referencing, or it is to make your clientele comfortable because no one likes to hear these things. So I think there are many mechanisms at work, just like the questions of how do ethics and morals and mores work in general. It's complicated, and sometimes it's pressure, sometimes it's deceit, sometimes it's cynicism, sometimes it's self-deception. I think all of those are somewhat at play, but it's hard to stand up against the establishment in general. And there's also a very famous line, and I meant to check out whether it's really Mark Twain or H.L. Mencken or both of them, but that you can't convince a person of something when his job depends on, or his income depends on, believing the opposite. And this also is true. People are dependent on going along. These structures are real. These structures of power are real.
But what I'm trying to say is that even this little country of mine, the Netherlands, is extremely at the forefront always to jump into or to help the US and other European countries in their imperialist endeavors. They want to be the leader of the NATO. The recently Dutch soldiers were found in Lebanon, and I'm like, apartheid is a Dutch invention. It's a Dutch word. So I'm always saying that I feel it's much more Europe wide. Often there's this idea that the rest of Europe are vassal states of the United States, and I in a way I agree, but I think there is not a lot of difference between, for example, the UK's role in imperialism and countries like France or smaller countries like the Netherlands. I feel they all have a very active role when it comes to Western imperialism. What would you say about that?
Well, I think you're just being proud because if the British taught the Americans all that they know, the Dutch taught the British all that they know. After all, it was
Yeah.
the glorious revolution in 1688 that modernized Britain. This is a Dutch invention. The Netherlands was in the forefront of colonialism, imperialism, racism. but then it lost its military and naval dominance to Britain, but it still showed what it could do in Batavia, and the colony of today's Indonesia was very brutal. So this is indeed something that is European-wide. I think it's an interesting question historically, by the way, whether there is historically and ideologically a difference of Northern and Southern Europe in this regard. Southern Europe, Catholic Europe, was the first global imperialists, Spain and Portugal, and they lost out eventually to Northern Europe, to the Netherlands and to Britain especially, and to France. France is a little bit in between the Protestant Catholic divide, but there were a few checks, a little bit mild checks on this, coming from the Pope and Catholicism, not at the beginning, but by the 17th and 18th centuries. The Spanish decided that it was wrong to enslave the indigenous populations of the Americas, though not the not the Africans. So it was a kind of mixed bag. In Northern Europe, there weren't too many scruples of that kind for a long time. Anyway, this is a footnote, but I would agree that this has been European-wide, and it manifests whoever is the dominant power. So the Netherlands was a great ocean power and a great imperial power up until the 17th century. It lost out to Britain after that. British dominance came in the 19th century because of the steam engine, basically, and military power that came with industrialization. And so I wouldn't say that it's distinctly cultural within Europe, but I would say that the dominant culture that we saw turned on which was the dominant power. France has had its civilizing mission. Britain did it in a different way. Each one that came to the fore was sure that God was on their side, that culture was on their side, that technology was on their side, and probably genes, when they discovered what genes were, or evolution was on their side. So I think each one has had its turn. But European dominance now real dominance is 250 years old, and European ascendance is 500 years old. And our cultures are deeply penetrated by those ideas. And we're living through this moment, especially with the rise of China, where this is coming to an end. So I think that this really is a long cycle. We happen to be observers of the moment when the whole thing is falling down. One might have said that at the end of World War II, with the end of the straightforward imperialism. But that was a long, drawn-out 40 years, 50 years war to end the direct European imperial rule. But the ideas didn't stop, and the U.S. does its empire in a different way. The U.S. runs its empire mainly through regime change operations, and through military bases. So the U.S. has military bases in 80 countries, about 800 military bases around the world, and it overthrows governments regularly. And that's how it runs its empire, rather than directly having its place on the map. So we're still very much in the midst of this.
It is it's so profoundly weird, I would say, especially for those of us my age who experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis and the first Cold War, not the one that we're in right now, which we now see is really a continuation. It never ended in 1992, contrary to legend. I make the mistake every once in a while of actually reading the comment lines under Financial Times articles. And the Financial Times is, Gideon Rockman, for example, writes something where he maybe has a sentence or two about the nuclear threat. And then all of the comments are, what threat? Don't let them blackmail us. Basically, what's a little nuclear war among friends? So you read this in the comment section and my God, you realize also how sad it must be to be a writer or reporter when that's your readership. Oh, come on, are you kidding? Because every comment is, don't worry about it. Don't be blackmailed about it. It's not real. I bet he won't do it. Let's find out. So what? And then if somebody writes, oh my God, we should take nuclear war seriously. Russian troll, Putin apologist, the moment you say something. So it is bizarre. And we had that experience, by the way, as a little controlled trial in the US. Biden says nothing about this, basically. But at I think it was 2022 in the fall, he said in a fundraiser to donors, which is really the only time he speaks to the, quote, American people, when he's speaking to some rich people in a private donor fundraiser. He said, we may be on the road to Armageddon. And he used the word Armageddon. What was the reaction in the press? It was literally the Wall Street Journal the next day or the day after in the editorial page chastising the president for scaring the American people. And how dare he use a word like that? And what's gotten into him? So the norm is, don't discuss this. Don't consider this. And the idea is probably they won't do it. Oh, it's only 10% chance the world ends. It's the most insane feature of our time right now. And again, the pain of all of this is if one knows just a little bit of history, how false readings on radar of a bird flock that passed the radar looked like incoming ICBMs, and or a training tape that was left on that led a nighttime supervisor in an early warning system think that there was an incoming attack. Or the most famous, or should be famous, actually it's almost unknown, I should say, but the most remarkable incident in modern human history. It's a good quiz question to ask people. Which one individual above all most clearly saved the world? And the man's name is Arkhipov, and he's known by 1 in a million or maybe less in the world. And he was the Soviet political officer on a disabled Soviet submarine where the skipper of the submarine had ordered the firing of a nuclear-tipped torpedo after Kennedy and Khrushchev had arrived at their compromise agreement, but the word had not reached the disabled submarine. And under U.S. military doctrine, being fired upon by any nuclear weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, or a strategic nuclear weapon, was to trigger the full nuclear arsenal of the United States against Russia, Soviet Union, China, and all of Central and Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime. And the estimates of those days was 700 million deaths out of 3 billion. Of course, not taking into account the global famine that would have followed and all the rest. And we came within a second of that. And it's not even known by most. And Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers and Martin Sherwin, the great historian who died a couple of years ago and is the author of co-author of Oppenheimer, which became the movie, wrote about this in a book that everybody should read called Gambling with Armageddon. And the point of the book, which focuses on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but more generally discusses the fact that we're in the gamble with survival of the human species to an incredible extent. And he talks about this Arkhipov episode. People don't know these things. They're not thinking. They're not discussing them. They're not learning about them. And so somehow the fact that the U.S. might be embarrassed in Ukraine by not having its absolutely stupid idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine succeed is worth gambling with Armageddon. That's the situation we're in. And yes, every European leader stands up and salutes the United States in this, lies about everything, and says, sure, why risk it? And again, these leaders of the Baltic states, what the hell are they doing? They have countries of 1 or 2 or 3 million people on the border of Russia. They are not nuclear powers, but they're saying Russia must be destroyed. Are they out of their minds? Do they think the U.S. is really going to keep them safe? Do they think a nuclear war is going to just be dandy for Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania? What is on their minds? But your point is right. It's completely not understandable to me, but it is the reality that we do not have any self-control right now. And we have no capacity to understand our own behavior, maybe because it is this agenda of secretive intelligence armies for the last not even 30 years, but for the last 60 years. And it's on a kind of fixed rudder, and our politicians are useless in this. This is really where we stand. By the way, it's fascinating, and it's so hard to uncover all of this, but there's a lot of known history and some not so known history about how the CIA immediately starting in 1945, following OSS work, started running the neo-Nazi units of Western Ukraine. The same groups, the Banderistas and others that are real. This isn't just a Russian figment of the imagination. These are literal groups with literal people who were literally on the CIA and MI6 account and were run for decades because they would help to undermine Russia or undermine the Soviet Union. So these games, which, are the fun games of the James Bond movies and were mocked in Mad Magazine as the white spy and the black spy, playing games with this is what's bringing us to 90 seconds to midnight right now.
I completely agree. Just again, a few points here. I mean, about the fact that there's been this disappearance of fear of nuclear war and this constant talking about the Russians bluffing. Bluffing is a word that comes from gambling. It just confirms that we are gambling on what the other side is doing, that we assume that they're bluffing, even whilst we insist that then we are not. It's an astonishing thing. And if it's the risk that they're not bluffing and that we could find ourselves in a nuclear war is 0.1%. That is too big a risk, far too big a risk. Any risk at all in this kind of situation is far too great, especially given that all of these problems which have existed and which have accumulated and which are getting worse are still problems that can be resolved properly through negotiations in a way that is not going to compromise or endanger anyone. And if we're talking about specifically the Baltic states, which are small countries next to this giant colossus, which is Russia, the best guarantor of their independence and security is Russia itself, not the superpower far away, a continent and an ocean away, which can only ultimately protect them by risking its own existence. Again, I would have thought that was obvious, and I would have thought, again, that a US president or a US administration ought to be pointing that fact out to them. And so should the other European countries, which are being led by the Baltic states into policies which I find astonishing. The influence, the sway that these Baltic states have achieved over European policy absolutely astonishes me. Now, there's not.
I can tell you,
yeah.
just to tell you a story about that. This Kaja Kallas, the leader of Estonia, I knew her dad actually rather well, Sim Kallas, who was in 1991 president of the Central Bank of Estonia. Estonia gained its independence in 1991. I had a very wonderful Estonian Canadian student who said, "Jeff, come to Tallinn. They need help." So I came to Tallinn back in 1991, in March 1991. Interestingly, the hotel was freezing. We had to wear a winter coat because there was no heat. There was no fuel. And I had a meeting with Sim Kallas one evening in a bar, and he described to me, "What do we do? We're in the ruble zone. We need to have we're a new nation. We need to have an independent currency." So I knew something about that. That was my my profession. So I designed basically on a napkin that evening how Estonia could make a national currency. They adopted it literally the next day, that idea, and a month later, the Estonian kroon appeared. Now, what's interesting for me is I was there. The Russians didn't try to stop it. The Soviet Union wasn't even over yet at that time. And there was no attempt by Russia to invade Estonia. There was no desire to, quite the contrary. I was working with Gorbachev's team. I was working with Yeltsin after September 1991. I was working with the Estonians on helping them to design a post-ruble currency, which went into effect. The Russians wanted peace. They wanted quiet. They wanted rebuilding. They wanted integration with Europe. It was so normal. This is exactly the moment that Cheney is saying, okay, now we dismember Russia. This is the crazed mindset of this hubristic, indispensable nation, the United States. It just could not say yes. And now I see the daughter. Yeah, I got one of the highest awards of the Estonian state for my work in helping them set up the currency, because it remained stable for the next 20 years, and then they adopted the euro. It was a good success, good economic success, especially for an evening discussion about how to set up a currency. And now I see this hatred from the Estonians, hatred, but provocation and warmongering, as if this is going to keep them safe. Are you kidding? It's completely the opposite. By the way, I was advisor to Poland in those years. I was their main outside advisor. And now I see Poland talking the same way. Radek Sikorski, the most aggressive foreign minister in Central and Eastern Europe, not to be compared with Baerbock, who is, Minister of War of Germany, in effect. But basically, where does the hate talk come from when it is not Russia that made these aggressions over the last 30 years? Just the opposite, when the United States could not say yes. But this is where the propaganda or the mental image or just the being suborned by U.S. Money and power, and the military-industrial complex has come in. Almost nobody tells the truth.
It's the best we have.
Okay.
I'm a big believer that because we're interconnected so profoundly across the world in our fate, whether it is environment, climate, nuclear war, pandemic, you name it, national borders are not so meaningful as sometimes we think. But we got organized in a world of nation states, one that was largely built by European imperial powers in the 19th and 20th century. I believe we need global government, not as a sole government, obviously, but as a way to solve global problems.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an idea that is essentially 1 century old. We never had global institutions until the middle of the 19th century, starting with the telegraph and postal union, and the beginnings of global pandemic preparedness, we'd say now, but it was for infectious disease.
Yeah.
That was the beginning in the 1850s under European imperial domination and control. But even then, that wasn't really a global government in any way. Then after World War I, the idea was to create a League of Nations, and that got started by the British and the US in 1920-21, but the US decided not to join. So it was kind of stillborn, and it didn't prevent World War II, obviously. Then in the middle of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, who's my favorite all-time president, said we need to try again with another organization. This time it ended not in Geneva, but on the East River, the United Nations. And it was born in 1945. It is only the second attempt in all of human history to have a universal body to address global scale issues. It's filled with problems. And one of the big problems is it was designed in a two-tiered way. 5 countries were given preeminence, that you can't do anything binding without their unanimous agreement. And that is the US, and it was originally the Soviet Union, China, which was originally the nationalist China, and Britain and France. So 5 powers, which we now call the P5, or the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, can veto anything that is binding and can block any change in the charter itself that is the constitution of the UN.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, it's also a universal body, but it has a single chamber, a little bit like the Senate, in that each state in the US gets 2 votes, but in the UN, each country gets 1 vote. And that's true whether you're Nauru, which is the smallest population of the 193 with 12,000 people, or China, or now actually, I should say up to date, India, which is now the most populous country, both China and India, 1.4 billion people. So they each get 1 vote. Now, this also has its problem, obviously, in terms of, is that the right mode of representation of people around the world? So I've been donating, I'd say, most of my time in the last 25 years to the UN. I am fully aware of all of the difficulties, contradictions, and so on. But I love the idea that 8 billion people through 193 representative national governments talk to each other at least. I love the idea of the UN Security Council, and I testified a couple of times in the UN Security Council in the last 2 years. And I love the idea that in a civilized way, no one shooting at each other in the room, except through their verbal statements. They're actually talking. Does it work great? No, obviously it does not work great. Could it be reformed? Absolutely. Again, we could have days of discussion of what to do. But what else are we going to do but to try to make it work and to understand that it's only the second attempt in the 300,000 years of our species to actually have global governance.
Yeah, and okay, well, that's, I suppose, puts it in perspective and explains why maybe new forms are required at some point. But you might say it's like democracy, the worst form of government except for all the rest. But
yeah, but it also needs to be fixed, and this is part of the job of the 21st century.
I'm itching to get to recent affairs, but I can't resist, maybe because of my training with Noam Chomsky early on. When you say, okay, Roosevelt, I mean, given the makeup, especially the P5, would you not say that the desire was not to have a world government, but to divvy up the world for U.S. and for major power control, and the UN was a sort of a legitimizing force to allow the U.S. to appear to have international goals when really it was trying to control its hegemony? I'm going to be the devil's advocate and say that.
No, I think at the time, Roosevelt, by the way, was really unusual in American leaders. He really was actually an anti-imperialist, and he really believed in economic rights, and he believed in human rights, and he was really an extraordinarily decent, unbelievably shrewd and effective and clever politician. So I really like him. From everything I've studied over the last 50 years, I like him. Okay. Complicated personality also, by the way, but I like him a lot. And I don't think that it was not to divvy up the world. He was no fan of the British Empire, which was the dominant empire up until the end of World War II. The United States became the dominant empire afterwards. But at a practical level, it was not actually to give control to the five. It was to give control to the one. Yeah. The United States was going to largely run the show.
Exactly.
But had it been Roosevelt, it actually would have run the show in a quite decent way. It would have decolonized the world. It would have made for good neighbors in Latin America. It would have done things that Roosevelt truly believed in. He submitted in 1944 to the U.S. Congress an economic Bill of Rights. His wife, after Roosevelt's death, Eleanor Roosevelt, presided over the promulgation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was not a game. That was not a PR stunt. That was a very deeply moving, important step in our global evolution as humanity, to say that there are basic rights for all people as individuals around the world and their human dignity. So now, has the UN served all these high purposes? Not quite. But at the same time, the bodies that have been created by the UN, UNESCO for education, science, and culture, for ITU for international telecommunications, WHO for the World Health Organization, and many, many others, are actually led, people say by international bureaucrats, but they're led by people who really believe in the international mission. They're multicultural, multinational, and above any other institution I know, they take a global perspective, which is very hard because if you're in the US, you're almost compelled to take a national perspective. Even if you're in a university, our universities are funded by the Defense Department. They're funded by the State Department. They're funded by government grants. My colleagues are often aghast at what I say because I don't take the US government line. Partly I'm not dependent on it, thank God. But, I find in the UN, the ethos really is different because people come from different countries, Now, the U.S. still, has its hand on things through its share of the budget and so forth. But truly, among all of our imperfect institutions, if you want to hear an international point of view, not just a national government point of view, the UN you're going to hear it much more in the UN than typically you'd even hear in an East Coast university of the United States.
Okay, absolutely. No doubt about that. The universities are not. Yeah, okay. We won't get into that. But and so this is a great segue because people might imagine, based on your comments about Roosevelt and the fact that you have been a quote unquote insider in many ways, that you hew the insider line. And we're going to spend the next few minutes and not as much anywhere near as much as I'd like, making it clear that you're not. We're going to talk about. I looked just at random at 9 pieces you've written, and we won't get through all 9, unfortunately. But they deal with Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, the CIA, U.S. foreign policy, in a way which, in almost every way, radically differs from the party line of what you'd hear in either mainstream media or in the U.S. government or in many other places. So let's talk about some things. And as I say, people should be prepared for arguments and discussions that are going to upset a lot of people. But it's important to have them. And I'm always impressed that you have the courage to state them. The first one is a framework, one you wrote in November 30th, early on. Relatively early on after October 7th, a framework for peace in Israel and Palestine, where you argued right off that the only way to end this was to welcome Palestine as a UN member state. This might shock some people that the first thing you do after what many people what many people claim is an unprovoked, or at least certainly an unacceptable and horrific act of terrorism, to recognize Palestine as a UN member state, with pre 1967 borders, and why don't you just spend a few minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I think that there are 2 overarching issues, I would say, about all of my views. One is that any event is not really an event, it's part of a dynamic process.
Okay.
So you can never say, well, things started on October 7, Hamas made an attack, or that Putin unprovoked attacked Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. So whenever you see in the media, which you see all the time, unprovoked, it's phony. As a physicist, you would say, the world is governed by dynamical processes. They could have some uncertainties in them in the wave equation, or in Newtonian mechanics. We thought we were able to predict everything about the future from knowing the current state. But in any event, there are dynamics, and that is true. So never look at a snapshot. Always look at the dynamics. The second thing is there are 2 versions of the world, if I could simplify a little bit. The United States policy truly is that the U.S. should run the show. Mm-hmm. This is actually formal doctrine. If you read formal, boring doctrine, like the security strategy or defense strategy of the United States, or in the academic world, the grand strategy in the international relations literature of the United States is to be the predominant power, or sometimes called the hegemon, or sometimes called the unipolar country. I really disagree with that philosophically, because we are 4.1% of the world population. Who the hell gave 4.1% of the world population the right to run the other 95.9% of the world population? That's absurd. So these are the 2 predicates of almost everything I do, which is say, what are the dynamics here? So how do you help to move a more complex, multidimensional, dynamic system, if you want to put it that way? And second, don't take the U.S. line, take a global perspective, take a shared perspective. So when it comes to Israel and Palestine, there are two peoples, millions of each, on a common land. There is a long history of controversy about that, going back to the Balfour Declaration. There are heated ideological arguments on both sides. There are both sides saying the other doesn't belong here at all. And this is fraught with all of the heat, emotion, deep religious beliefs, and many other things that are part of this conflict. But it also has meant perpetual war and perpetual cycles of war. And it has also meant, in my experience, in my view, tremendous suffering of the Palestinian people relative to the suffering of the Israeli Jewish people, because Israel, quote, won. And it has had the United States at its back. And the Palestinian people have suffered tremendously in this. Since 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza and part of the Golan Heights and so on. And I first went to Israel in 1972. In about the same, it was the same summer vacation after high school that I visited my East German pen pal. And I went to Israel for the first time, and I was told a phrase called facts on the ground, that we are going to put settlements into these occupied, conquered lands to make facts on the ground so that we'll always control those places. I was kind of innocent then. I didn't really understand the significance of it, but 52 years later, I came to understand much sooner than that this is going to be a recipe for profound unhappiness, injustice, and violence, and it has been. So I believe that those facts on the ground weren't quite so factual or clever as they said. There are now hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
700,000.
Yeah, and depending on where you draw lines and how you count, a couple 100,000 in East Jerusalem in some sense, or in the environment of East Jerusalem, and another 500,000 away from Jerusalem. And that has created a lot of zealotry as well, because a lot of these settlers have a religious, deeply
messianic
embedded
religious.
Yeah, exactly. And so they believe, well, God gave us this land and it's ours, and there's nothing more to say about it. So to my mind, we've got to end this cycle of violence before it ends up killing everybody, including everybody, in an escalating global war. And the way to do it is to divide the territory according to international law that has been promulgated for the last 57 years since the Six-Day War. And by international law, I mean votes of the UN Security Council principally, because that has said we need two states. It should be on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And it seems to me that this is what bargaining theory calls the focal point for the bargain. It's the only one that has a plausibility that can actually reach an outcome short of all-out war. And so there are people who say, well, we should have one state, or we should have a binational state, or we should have a democratic state. There are others who say there should be no Israel, wipe it off the map. There are those that say there should be no Palestine, wipe it off the map. I believe that the way to get this cycle of extreme violence and cruelty over is to implement international law. And I think it's going to happen, actually, that Palestine will become the 194th member of the United Nations. The U.S. is going to fight against this, but in the end, I don't think the U.S. can block this from happening. Israel, of course, is aghast at it.
Yeah.
So what?
When you say Israel's aghast, I think it's important to point out the government of Israel is aghast.
Yeah, let me put it that way.
I'm not sure the public is.
No, you're right. I agree with you. I agree completely with you.
Now, I want to get to some key points which you make, which I think are interesting, that counter the general narrative. But one point I do want to say, people would counter you, say Israel isn't occupying Gaza because Israel removed itself in 2005 or so willingly, and it occupies the West Bank, but not Gaza. Would you at least agree with that or no?
No, not at all.
Good.
If you have a prison and the guards guard the inmates going in and out of their cells, but they don't live inside the cells, I would say they're still occupying the prison.
Okay.
And so that's what Gaza is.
You have it exactly right. The students were right with Vietnam, and the students are right with Gaza and Palestine. They're protesting political actions of the worst sort by the United States. The U.S. and Israel are essentially together committing a genocide. We'll probably have that definitively determined by the International Court of Justice when it makes its ruling, which could come sometime in the coming months. The court has already said that there are plausible grounds for believing that Israel is in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. And there is no doubt in any way that Israel is doing this daily with the support, and could not do it otherwise than with the daily support of the U.S. government, which goes out of its way to say that there are no red lines. Israel gets what it asks for, and the students are protesting, of course. But what is amazing to me, maybe it shouldn't be amazing. I find myself endlessly naive all through my life because I'm constantly amazed by things I shouldn't be amazed by. But the crackdown is brutal. It is thoughtless. It is based on phony claims that this is about anti-Semitism on campus. And we have to, the police are being called into my campus at Columbia University and to dozens of campuses around the world to keep things safe, when, of course, there was no threat to safety of anybody by peaceful protests. The only threats come when the police come on campus, brutally arrest students and faculty, I should add, though the students have taken the brunt of this. And then every kind of falsehood is put forward by the administrators, by the police, and then we have these visitations by members of Congress. If you ever want to have a lower regard for politicians, nothing like watching them stir up added trouble. We had the Speaker of the House of Representatives make that urgent stop on the Columbia campus to bemoan anti-Semitism on our campus as a crackdown came of this brutal sort, twice ordered by the administration, with the New York Police Department arresting dozens and dozens of students on each occasion. The university peremptorily first suspending and then expelling students, and setting either the most arbitrary deadlines or not even announcing deadlines before calling in the police, as was the case on April 18. And it's happening, Alexander, all over the country, which also is leads one to suspect that there's a lot of coordination and cooperation underway, because I personally would guess that this is not independent actions by dozens and dozens of universities, but lots of discussion about how to make these crackdowns and so on. It's rather rather shocking period. But the students are not stopped, and they are not being bowled over by this. They keep coming in larger and larger numbers. We're going to continue to have a very hot time of this as long as this genocide continues, and it looks likely to continue right now as long as the U.S. government continues to give it full backing, which it does.
Which it does. And I'm going to make a few quick observations. I mean, as I said, I remember the Vietnam protests, and I remember the crackdowns that happened on universities in connection with the Vietnam protests. And at that time, and I see no reason why it should be different this time, crackdowns like this were radicalizing. They radicalized more students. They made those students who were caught up in those crackdowns angry and upset, and obviously frightened, but also angry and more sure that they were, that they were on the right side. And it caused protests in the end to spread and get stronger. And the other thing I remember from the 1960s and early 1970s is that, of course, if you start arresting students, if you start doing this kind of behavior against students, then it's not just the students themselves you radicalize, but of course students have parents and family, and they become concerned and they start asking questions as to why things are being done in the way they are. And I don't want to push this further, but I mean, I think this is a misguided strategy because, of course, the problem is exactly the one you said. The problem is not what is going on in Colombia and in other universities. It is what is going on in Gaza. Now, history sometimes rhymes, as we often hear. There was a Democratic Party convention in 1968 when the protests really began to take off. It happened in Chicago. We have a Democratic Party Congress again in Chicago. There's growing disquiet amongst a large proportion of the base of the Democratic Party. This situation seems to me an attempt to get this all under control, this crackdown, all under control, when in fact it could do the opposite and generate more protests, including embarrassingly at the convention itself or around the convention itself. And the administration itself doesn't have a plan about how to move forward. Now, the other thing I just quickly wanted to say, running on a bit, but we've had, as you said, the ICJ case, which is coming probably in the summer sometime. And we've had a case at the International Criminal Court, which is supposed to be under intense pressure not to issue arrest warrants, and has now issued a statement, unprecedented.
An amazing statement. Yeah, absolutely unbelievable.
Saying that they are that they will not let them, they will not accept if they are pressured in the way that they clearly are. So again, these are not really questions, but can you address some of the points I've said and maybe take this discussion further?
I think the key point is that what is happening in Gaza is completely illegal and completely outrageous, morally, politically, practically. The only possible outcome of it, if it continues this way, is a wider war in the Middle East, which would turn into a world war. I think many in Israel among the leadership want that. They clearly want to provoke a wider war. They have been not very subtle in trying to draw the United States into a war with Iran for many, many years. And the attack on the Iranian consulate last month and the follow-up was yet another attempt to draw the United States into a wider war. So we are on a path that's absolutely devastating. What is key, as you've been discussing and I've been discussing, and I've been involved in the diplomacy at the United Nations, is that the U.S. and Israel are essentially completely isolated in world opinion, other than the countries that the United States can arm twist desperately to fall into line. Britain can always be counted on to at least abstain. If the United States says jump, Britain will jump to some level, no matter the pain and the disagreement within the British public on this. And that happened again. Where the dynamics are right now, of course, is that the world is saying we need this war to end and we need a state of Palestine as a member of the United Nations, period. 57 years onward after the 1967 war, and that means the occupation of Palestine by Israel and the apartheid regime that became increasingly brutal, and that is the basis of why this genocidal action in Gaza is taking place right now. This has to end. And so, as I'm sure listeners will recall, last month, the Palestine Authority revived their application for UN membership, which had been put aside by the United States demand back in 2011. Back then, that's already 13 years ago, the UN Security Council meeting as the admissions committee had said, you fit all the criteria. Palestine should be a UN member state. And the US said, oh, yes, we agree completely, but not now. Just give it a little time. Take observer status. And this is the US ploy, which is always put off any decision that is in favor of Palestine at the behest of Israel. And that means put off forever. So the United States back in 2011 convinced the Palestinian authorities, just take observer status. Membership will come soon. Of course, membership never came. What came was a genocidal war instead. The Palestine Authority revived its application, which had never been dismissed. It was just adjourned, sine die, without a date, and they revived it last month. Suddenly, we see the whole world supports this. 140 countries. Now it's, I think, 143, if I have the count right, because new countries are joining, already have diplomatic relations with Palestine. And when this went to the Security Council, I thought for sure the arm twisting by the United States would at least hold Japan, Korea, close U.S. allies in line against the application. But no, they came out firmly saying, what else? What are we going to do? We have to move to an answer. So in the end, the vote last month was 12-1. 12 countries saying immediate membership of Palestine, 1 vetoing the United States, and 2 abstentions, the UK and Switzerland. When you have a veto in the Security Council, this now goes on an emergency basis to the General Assembly. It looks like there will be a vote on May 10 in the General Assembly for UN membership of Palestine. Now, what is the United States doing? It's arm twisting every place. It's doing whatever bribes, whatever threats it can make everywhere to try to keep the vote down in the General Assembly. It's also doing something which is, I think, we'll see, but I think part of the incredible U.S. naivete which has gone on with Trump and now with Biden, which is it's trying to cut a deal with the Saudis. Come on, just announce that you'll have diplomatic relations with Israel. We'll give you nuclear technology. We'll give you F-35s. We'll give you a military alliance. We'll do everything. Well, a lot of tempting things on the table. What they're saying to the Saudis is break with the rest of the Arab world, break with the rest of the world. Just come with us. We'll give you every goodie that you want. And what they're doing is what, of course, the UK and the US has done with the Arab world for 100 years, trying to divide it, trying to bribe it, trying to threaten it, trying to cajole it to play the US game. I don't think it's going to work. But even last week, there was Jake Sullivan in Britain at an FT conference, speaking his usual nonsense, but saying, "Oh, we believe in a two-state solution. We think there should be a process." Isn't that nice? We think there should be a process, a pathway to help meet the needs of the Palestinian people. In other words, we think there should be a road to nowhere, never, anytime, because we are the firm supporters of Israeli negation of any real peace in the region. So here's where we are. We have a vote coming up. I think it will be May 10 in the UN General Assembly. We have an Arab League meeting in Bahrain scheduled for May 16. After the vote in the General Assembly, this will go back to the Security Council. Will the U.S. continue to be the sole stalwart for war, which, of course, has been the U.S. vocation all along? Or will the will of the entire world community, ex-U.S. and Israel, prevail? It's pretty interesting because this is bleeding support for Biden. Trump will be worse, but how can anyone support Biden in this context? You have to have some minimum standard, not only the other side is completely whatever on this, because I think with Trump, we have no notion, but unpredictability. With Biden, we have certain failure on this path, and he's losing support, certainly of anyone under 35. But actually, when I say that, because that's what the opinion surveys say, I get deluged with not so nice mail from older people saying, "Don't speak for me. I'm against him. This is terrible. I'm for Palestine." So there are a lot of older people that are absolutely on the same side. Biden is blowing any chance at all politically because the power of the Israel lobby to this moment remains dominant, even when a president is staring political defeat in the face within a few months over this. It's stunning to watch. So students and faculty being arrested, protests being violently put down, an administration isolating the United States diplomatically in the world, nonsense spoken by the government that it's going to divide once again the Arab people. I don't believe it. And this is where we stand right now. Absolutely horrible to watch the real mass killing and deaths in Gaza, and then horrible to watch this political spectacle and this complete collapse of civil rights in the United States.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Just a few quick observations. Again, not really questions. But firstly, even if the United States gets its deal with Saudi Arabia, what difference is it going to make? It's not going to change anything on the ground in Gaza. We're still going to get the same policies, but implemented by Israel in Gaza, probably even more violently because they'll be more encouraged to do them. And that's going to provoke more protests around the world, put more pressure on the Saudis themselves. It's not going to solve problems. This idea that you can resolve the problem in the Middle East by cutting deals with Arab governments like the Saudi government, it's just been tried again and again and again. It hasn't worked. The problem, the conflict is still there because it is a conflict ultimately between peoples. And unless and until this is properly understood and accepted and people work on that basis, then we're never going to get a solution to this problem. The second is going back to that Security Council vote when the United States blocked Palestine getting statehood. I have to say, I was absolutely horrified by what the US ambassador said over the vote, because basically the comment made was, we won't do this, we won't recognize the state of Palestine until there is an agreement, a negotiated settlement between Israel and the
That's
Palestinians. which in effect gives the Israelis, the Israeli government, which is adamantly opposed to a Palestinian state, a veto over the entire process. They can always string out any negotiations which happen. They can always complicate them, add conditions, do all of those things to keep this thing going indefinitely. And again, you're essentially surrendering your own ability to make decisions on this question to another government which is hostile to the whole idea of a Palestinian state. I find that astonishing. The third thing is recognizing Palestine as a state not only would be the just and correct thing to do from a moral and legal position, but it would also, in my opinion, increase US leverage over Israel if there really is a desire to achieve peace. The fact that they are not doing that undermines whatever leverage they have over Israel. Again, that seems to me obvious. It is getting everything completely the wrong way round. So, of course, we're going to see more crisis and we're going to see more protests in the United States. And that is, for me, the single biggest change, because up to now, in every iteration of the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian-Israeli conflict that I can remember, US opinion has been solid in support of US policy with respect to Israel, supporting Israel. Today, it seems that is no longer the case. And I'm going to suggest that is the single greatest change, the most important change that we have seen, and the one that gives hope that in the future, we will start to see a change in US policy and a change towards actual peace in resolving this conflict. So I consider these protests in Colombia to be enormous, and not just Colombia, obviously, across the universities, an enormous and important sign and a crystallizing moment.
I think you've hit it exactly right on every point. And it's worth pointing out, if people are not aware, why is it so important to have this UN membership of Palestine, a state of Palestine, sovereign state recognized by the world community? The reason is that already going back to 2002, to the Arab Peace Initiative, and repeated since then, though not reported in our newspapers, par for the course, but repeated by the Arab League, repeated by the Arab and Islamic nations, again last November in Riyadh after this latest spasm of murder and massacre broke out in Gaza. The Arab and Islamic countries, and by the way, this includes clearly Iran, which has said so repeatedly, are ready for peace based on two states, with Palestine being a sovereign state, borders 1967 according to international law, capital in East Jerusalem, and control over the Islamic holy sites. That's the bottom line. And peace can be made on this absolutely sound, fair, practical, achievable, within reach grounds. And so the whole claim, the meme, the mantra, endlessly, falsely repeated, there's no way to make peace, there's no one to talk to, they're out to kill us, all the rest, is plainly, blatantly falsified by the Arab and Islamic world. And they are the ones that can make the peace happen and will make the peace happen as part of a peace settlement. And the United States knows this. And Israel knows this. And the Israeli government knows this. They don't want peace. They want greater Israel. That's the problem. They're not looking for a practical solution. They're not looking for a fair solution. They're not looking for a just settlement. We are in the hands of extremists. We are in the hands of extremists that demand everything and have a lobby behind that. And those demands are what blocks the peace and threatens the world. Everybody gets it. Our students get it. The other 190 UN member states get it. But the Israeli government doesn't want it. That's the problem. That's why this vote is so essential. That's why the US actions are so completely destructive, self-destructive of the politics, self-destructive of American interests, destructive of peace, all of it. But it's all predicated at the core on a fundamental irrationality of a radical extremist government in Israel, which has thought all along we can get what we want. The US stands irrevocably with us. We have all the power. Who's going to stop us? And so it's this mix of arrogance and extremism that brings us to this point. But the world is getting it. The question is, does Biden get anything anymore? Does he care? Jake Sullivan, not exactly the most sensitive barometer of global truth. He's the one, of course, who said last fall the Middle East is more quiet than it's been in 20 years. The week before the explosion occurred, showing how completely out of touch with reality they are. This is the question for me. Will they finally wake up at this penultimate moment? The answer probably is no, I have to say, unfortunately, because we could have the same discussion about Ukraine, and what we see is more and more irrationality in the West, less and less ability to have any kind of reasoned discussion, factual discussion. It's just spinning fantasies right now. And when people don't like the fantasies, when you have leaders that have 20% approval ratings, 25% approval ratings, just close meetings, crack down, stop protests. This is the direction we're heading right now. Absolutely amazing.
I completely agree. Can I just very quickly add a few things and then just last words to Professor Sachs? The first is the point about negotiations, peace being unattainable. I'm sure, like Professor Sachs, I have been involved in many negotiations. I've mediated some. I've seen how even when the parties are enormously far apart or seem to be so, provided negotiations are conducted in good faith, solutions to even the most intractable problems eventually appear. The key problem is good faith. We have never had good faith negotiations at any point in the Middle East crisis, going all the way back to the 1940s. And by the way, we've also never had good faith negotiations over Ukraine, which is why we're in the crisis there that we are as well. But absolutely, if there are good faith negotiations, then all of these problems that people talk about, it's surprising. I've been surprised myself time and again how people who genuinely want to come to an agreement find solutions with each other. And I think that's a point that people never make. The second is about the administration. I don't believe there can be any possible chance of this administration doing anything that will create peace. I have followed them very closely. They say one thing, they do another. I think that this is an administration that always takes the maximalist position on anything. Whenever it talks about wanting compromise, be it over Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, Gaza, whatever, what they're basically doing is stringing us along. I've come to that conclusion. Many governments around the world have done. The Chinese complain about it. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the third is I think eventually there will be peace in the Middle East. I think there has to be, because there is no other ultimate way forward. And the sooner we start moving towards good faith negotiations, the better, and stop empowering these extreme elements, these maximalist elements, who, of course, because they're being empowered, they can always come back and say to other people in Israel, we don't need to negotiate. We can have it all because the Americans are behind us. The moment that ends, those people will diminish. That again is absolutely clear to me. So over you to Professor Sachs.
Yeah, just a word about good faith. We are roughly 1 century into this conflict. It started in World War I, so it's a little more than 1 century with the Balfour Declaration, Versailles, the British Mandate, and so forth. So we go back a century. There has never been good faith by Britain or the United States for one moment in this region. And the modus operandi has always been manipulate, divide and conquer, the most basic maxim of empire. And what the US and Britain have never done is dealt honestly with the Arab world. There is an Arab League, there is diplomacy, there is Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and so forth. They get together. If we had true good faith negotiations between the United States, EU, by the way, the P5, because China and Russia can be absolutely helpful in making peace in this region, because there's no divide among the great powers, so-called, in actually desiring peace and in a sensible way. But what the U.S. continues to do is think it can game it, manipulate it, fake it, delay it. And of course, the Israel lobby is relentless in its pressure, and I think its destructiveness of Israel's, even its survival, the way that things are going, if it continues this extremist course. So I just want to underscore good faith. Good faith means that the countries of the region are actually treated with respect, honesty, transparency, because everybody in the region has the same incentive for peace and the same view, which is 2 states living side by side in security, and leave us alone. We have other things we want to do rather than engulf ourselves in endless war. So good faith would be the way to make it happen. I think you said it absolutely perfectly. Well, Judge, good to be with you. The whole world, except for the United States and Israel, believes that we need to move now to 2 states living side by side, Israel and Palestine, with no doubt a wall between them at the start. This is not a happy relationship, but it doesn't have to be a site of bloodshed either. So in 2011, Palestine, which is already recognized as a state by 140 UN member states, though not by the United States, applied for full UN membership as what would be now the 194th UN member state. And when you make that application, it goes to the Security Council after clearing one step with the Secretary General of the UN. Then the Security Council, meeting as an admissions committee, not formally as the Security Council, but it's the same members, decide whether the criteria are met for UN membership. After that, if the answer is decided to be yes, as a yes, then it is forwarded to the UN Security Council for a vote. And if the Security Council approves, then it goes to the UN General Assembly. In 2011, at the technical level, the decision was that Palestine qualifies as a member state. And it would have gone forward, but for the United States, which at that point leaned on the Palestinian Authority and said, don't do it right now. It's not convenient, but it'll come very soon. Just accept observer status for the moment. That'll let you in the building, but don't press for full membership. You'll get there very soon. The United States gave assurances that this was just a short adjustment period. That, of course, was 13 years ago. The U.S. And Israel blocked it all that time. When the violence broke out on October 7th with the Hamas attack, and then after that, the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority said we cannot have peace unless we can have our state and our sovereignty for our people. And so they reactivated the application. It wasn't a new application. It was the application that was in suspension because of the United States. When they reactivated, all over the world, government said, of course, this is what is needed. And I had discussions with many senior diplomats, with foreign ministers, with heads of state about this, who believe that, of course, this is the way to end this conflict, that there should be two states, they should live in mutual security, that the United Nations should ensure that they're not at each other's throats when they are both side by side. Incidentally, Palestine would join under the UN Charter as a, quote, peace-loving state. It could not join as a state determined to bring an end to Israel. And the Arab and Islamic countries have made clear now, since the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, so for more than 20 years, that in the event of a two-state settlement, there would be normalization of diplomatic relations across the region with Israel. This would be the core of Israel's security, an end of state of war, an end of funding of military or militia that are in opposition to Israel and so forth. In other words, diplomacy, because a solution would have been reached. So the vote came to the Security Council last week with an overwhelming support, except as usual, one country stood in the way of the global will. Technically two. Israel, of course, this government opposes it. It wants ownership over all of the territory, both of Israel and of Palestine. That is the core reason for this conflict. Israel's demands that are, in my view, absolutely incompatible with peace and with justice. But the second obstacle is the United States, which has given essentially a blank check to Israel. And so when the vote came, it was absolutely remarkable. 12 countries out of the 15 voted for. 2 abstained because the UK will never vote against the United States. And Switzerland was the second one, leaned on by the US. And then the US vetoed this measure. Now, this proposition will go to the UN General Assembly, which has the jurisdiction to take up an issue when there is a deadlock in the Security Council. There will be a vote in the UN General Assembly sometime in the coming weeks on Palestine's membership. It will be overwhelming, but it will be advisory. It will show that the will of the world overwhelmingly is for two states living side by side. When the General Assembly takes that action, it will go back to the UN Security Council. Of course, the United States is absolutely preventing a solution right now. That has essentially been true for years and decades, I would say. The U.S. Is not an honest broker. It is a completely dishonest broker in this affair. Israel controls U.S. policy in this regard. The U.S. is completely subservient, despite this not being in America's interest at all. America is diplomatically isolated. It is on the wrong side of history. As we say, it is on the wrong side of justice. It is playing with fire, because we are every day in that tinderbox away from a general war in the Middle East. The U.S. is pumping in billions, tens of billions of dollars that we can ill afford, and that is no substitute for peace. And that vote of another 26 billion, depending on which parts you put in for Israel, was just made last Saturday with no strings attached by the U.S. Congress, because basically U.S. policy is run by the Israel lobby in this regard.
Before we
Yes.
get to the Congress, here's Secretary. This will aggravate you, Professor Sachs. Here's Secretary Blinken attempting to answer a very astute question: was the United States isolated at the UN?
On the UN Security Council, the United States was isolated yesterday. Your allies, close allies, France, Japan, and South Korea, both voted for admitting Palestine as a member. The Israelis, including Netanyahu, on the record saying they oppose two-state solution. So what is the path forward, and what message do you give to Palestinians and to moderates in the region if you truly want to isolate extremists?
First, we are committed, the United States is committed to achieving a Palestinian state. We believe that that is vital to having long-term, sustainable, durable peace and security. And of course, it's the only way to fulfill the aspirations, the rightful aspirations of the Palestinian people. But getting to that, achieving that state, has to be done through diplomacy, not through imposition. And the resolution that was voted at the Security Council will have no effect on actually moving things forward.
What is he talking about? The United States is committed to achieving a Palestinian state. This was not done through diplomacy. Does the man know what he's talking about?
Well, to be charitable to him, it's an idiotic statement. To be uncharitable, it is an utterly deceitful statement. I don't know with Blinken which it is. It's sheer, complete foolishness. And it's deadly. It's literally deadly to the Palestinian people. It is extremely dangerous. If he wants to have diplomacy, I can give him some good advice, even friendly advice. I talk to diplomats every day. Apparently, he does not in the same way. I speak to diplomats throughout the Middle East. They are ready for peace. They are ready for Israel's security. What he means is something else, which is that Israel gets a veto on Palestine's right to political self-determination. That there's no principle for that.
Right.
But that's what he's saying. He's saying that Israel gets to veto Palestine's right to self-determination. When that issue came up in the General Assembly several weeks ago in a resolution on Palestine's right to self-determination, the United States was one of 4 countries in the entire world, that's out of 193, to vote against Palestine's right to self-determination. Which were the 4? The 4 were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, which is an island.
Don't we own Micronesia?
Well, Micronesia has a compact with the United States that it must vote alongside the U.S. So it's 110,000 people in the Pacific. And the 4th was a very nice little island named Nauru with 12,000 people. Honestly, the United States is completely isolated. The problem with what Blinken says is that it reflects the astounding arrogance of the United States not to hear anything of the rest of the world and to make these utterances, which are meaningless, self-contradictory, inimical to solutions, and to believe that this is a way that grown-ups would talk. He is our chief diplomat, but he clearly does not understand the first thing about diplomacy in this response. There's every capacity to have a diplomatic solution to this crisis, except if the United States says we take no judgment other than what Israel wants. Because what this government of Israel wants is to deny Palestine anything. And if all we say is diplomacy comes down not to the 8 billion people around the world and the 192 other governments, but only to what one government, Israel, says, that's not diplomacy. That's recklessness.
How dangerous, how reckless, to pick up on your word, was the vote in the House of Representatives to send, again, depending upon the number, 13, 20, or 26 billion dollars to Israel and $61 billion to Ukraine, knowing that the latter doesn't go to Ukraine, the lion's share of it stays here, but it's sort of unleashed a false sense of euphoria among